Very good. So let us start off the event by land acknowledgement, and I like to invite MD Firoze alum for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Professor Chaudhary. We acknowledge that the land on which we reside is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people. Today, this place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to each other and our shared responsibility to this land where we live, learn, and work. Thank you.
Thank you, Firoze. The rapid revelation of social and internet-based collaborative media provide opportunities for enabling voices and collective innovation. But it also spreads risks for further excluding communities and marginalize them. As the remote engagement and online participation have become a new normal in the era of COVID-19, this is particularly very important to rethink the concept of participation and ask what does it entail in this digitally mediated age of to participate in communication for development and social change process. In this three-part webinar series, we intend to create opportunities to engage and collaboratively explore answer to the above questions. In the first part of the series, we explored the basic concepts and principles of participation, and then identified some non-negotiable component of participatory processes. Today, in part two, we will introduce to various tools and methods used for participation and community engagement processes. So today, we organize the event to be informative, engaging, and fun. We have three amazing speakers. Dr. Gordon Gall will introduce various online tools and methods. And then Dr. Katherin Reilly will talk about rethinking assumptions about participation in the digital age. And finally, Dr. Habib Ali will discuss about a non-profit organization initiative on remote and online community engagement tool for building community resilience during COVID-19. Each presenter will present for 15 minutes, followed by 10 minutes for discussion. In the discussion session, one of our discussants will join the presenter to start off the conversations, and we'll take some questions asked by our audience. Hopefully you will like it, and please bear with us as online participation sometimes become frustrating due to technical issues. I like to mention that this event is part of the Social Science and Humanity Research Council of Canada Connection Grant. And I also like to acknowledge the support of the facilitator of this event, two of my students, Firoze alum and Hossein Ali. Thank you for your help behind the scene. Now, let us move to the part of today's event that we are waiting for. As I introduce the speaker and start presenting and conversation with them, you can also engage and ask questions using the link shared in the chat box. Please do not ask question in the chat box. We are not monitoring the question in the chat box. You can like the question and asked by our participants to help us address most important questions. Ladies and gentlemen, let us invite Dr. Gordon Gall for his presentation. Gordon Gall is Professor of Communication and Academic Director of the Master of Arts in Communication Technology in the Media Technology Studies at the University of Alberta. He also worked in the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics, where he was Director of the Graduate Program in Media and Communication Regulation and Policy. welcome, Dr. Cal. The floor is yours. You can start presenting and have fun.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chowdhury. Nice to see you this morning. And thank you for inviting me to this. I'm just going to share my screen. Part of my presentation here. I assume you can see it okay?
Yeah, yes, yeah.
And behind me is the beautiful campus of the University of Alberta. The trees don't quite look like that yet. It'll be another month. Spring is slow to come in this part of the world, but we're looking forward to it nonetheless. So thank you. Today, I'm going to be talking about various platforms and methods that can be used to support participatory research and community engagement processes. And when Dr. Chowdhury asked me to do this presentation as part of the planning for this workshop series, we thought it would be useful to talk about some of the work that we're doing in Sri Lanka and Trinidad, particularly around engaging communities in agricultural sector to help them build capacity for innovating with digital technology. So for this presentation, I'm going to focus on two techniques that can help us to identify and select appropriate digital tools and platforms. Rather than talking about specific tools and platforms, this is more of a series of techniques using a community of practice approach to really identify the parameters that we're working with that will help us to choose the kinds of tools and platforms that will align with our needs. So we'll be talking about community orientations, exercise, and a tools landscape diagram that we use in our technology stewardship training program. So just as some background to the talk, this approach is adapted from the Action Notebook chapter from Wenger White Smith's book, Digital Habitats. If you're not familiar with this, it's from 2009. It is a really useful book, actually. It introduces the concept of technology stewardship, and it uses a communities of practice approach. And we are borrowing techniques from the book and adapting them in the agriculture sector to support participatory action research with agricultural extension officers in Sri Lanka and Trinidad. So when we're considering participatory tools, the community of practice approach is really interesting because if we think of it as a unit of social unit of analysis, communities of practice are often an interesting mix of stakeholders who are invested in a specific topic or domain of knowledge. It tends to have a little bit looser boundaries than, say, an organizational unit or other more formal units. But I think it's also more reflective of the way that people associate and the way social learning takes place often in these settings. In this view, participatory research is really about engagement to facilitate a process of social learning within the community of practice. And as such, it's not a transfer of knowledge, but it's more an interactive, multidimensional exchange of ideas, knowledge, and experience. And the tools, of course, that we want to use are intended there to support that kind of multidimensional exchange. Without getting too much into the theory, communities of practice have different orientations in how they approach social learning. These orientations embody certain participatory practices and goals, and an orientation is a pattern of activities that supports learning through which the members experience being a community. And we talk about 6 primary orientations in the training that we do with our tech stewards. These are drawn directly from the communities of practice literature, but we've adapted them over time as we've worked with them. The 6 orientations are described in the left column, along with the kind of typical communication activities on the right-hand side. So for instance, if a community of practice is focused on bringing the community members together for discussion through meetings, Typical activities would include scheduling those meetings, supporting participation in the meetings, whether that's face-to-face or distance or a combination, facilitation and support, moderation of meetings, decision-making, recording, so on. Other communities of practice may be oriented more towards open-ended conversations. So it's an ongoing or a series of discussion threads that are sharing knowledge or ideas about a particular topic or domain. And so the tools need to support things like single topic threads, multiple threads, highlighting key points. They may need to be searchable. There may need moderation features. You may need to be able to parse units out into subgroups, archiving, so on. And so these orientations include curated content, so focus on creating and sharing documents, project orientation, which is when the community is working towards a specific kind of problem-solving goal or building something together. Access to expertise. Communities are focused on locating authoritative or specialized knowledge. And social networking, which is where communities are really focused on building and maintaining social capital within the community. And sometimes that's in the service of some other priorities. So let's try an example. When we work with our tech stewards and are training them, when they work with their communities of practice, we ask them to go through a series of activities that help to identify the priority orientation. And in this case, for example, this is a hypothetical, but we might discover that the community of practice wants to store a collection of digital images showing damage from a recent storm. And that might come out of a community consultation activity. So what the steward would then do is look at the various types of orientations that it best matches up with, and in this case, probably curated content. And to respond to this priority, the community of practice would need to be able to share documents. Perhaps they'll want to be able to have members comment on those documents or rate them. Perhaps they'll want to be able to archive and search those documents later, and so on. Another brief example might be that we discover that the community members need an easier way to find other farmers or experts with knowledge about cultivating a special crop variety. So in this case, the priority could be social networking if it's about building social capital, but it could also be access to expertise if there are known experts in the group. And so to respond to this priority, the community of practice would need to be able to support things like question and answer interactions, helping people locate experts, maybe with some kind of directory, maybe a way to rate responses from the experts as better or worse or more appropriate, or tag those responses to make them easier to find or cluster them, and perhaps even follow an expert so that you're seeing their routine posts on topics of interest. So there are many possible configurations to these orientations, obviously. Within a community of practice, there's often several present at the same time. So taking steps to prioritize the orientations will help the community of practice to better define the goal and outcome measures of its participatory work. And in the workshops, we train our stewards to use a spidergram technique like this to visualize the priorities with their community members. And this allows them to have conversations about different priorities, but also try to work towards consensus on what are the most important priorities and the orientations of the community. And this step is really important to help them identify and choose the right kind of digital tools they'll need to support that community effort. So having established those orientations, we then turn to digital tools and platforms that are a good match for the orientation. So we make a distinction between tools and platforms in our training, although in practice they're often bundled together. So tools are discrete features or functions. A platform is generally a collection of tools in an app or a software package. And we also talk about 4 digital strategies that the community can adopt. These are the use what you have strategy, choose a specialized platform, choose a commercial platform, put different pieces together to create a workflow using something like IFTTT, or building your own. And you can see that those strategies really start with very basic, which is the use what you have, all the way to quite sophisticated. And typically with the groups we're working with, the use what you have strategy is where we're going to be starting with in most cases. So having been through that, we then introduce the tools landscape diagram. We have the tech stewards use this diagram to help match up tools with the type of participation that's responsive to those priority orientations that they've worked out with their community. The horizontal axis refers to tools that support real-time versus asynchronous interactions, which is fairly obvious. We're doing synchronous right now, but if we had a discussion board where there was a post and wait for a response later, that's obviously asynchronous. The vertical axis refers to tools that support what the community of practice literature calls a participation or interaction, or reification, or a more common term would be documentation. So in this axis, it reflects the interactive exchanges or whether the tool is supporting a document sharing feature of some type. The outer ring refers to tools that tend to support individual versus the inner ring for tools that support group interactions. So it's actually a very ingenious design that I didn't come up with. It came out of the handbook from Wenger, White and Smith. But it's quite a useful tool for plotting out the kinds of participatory interactions that different tools are good at supporting or not so good at. So for example, voice calling here in the upper right is a tool that tends towards interactive synchronous exchanges between individuals. Photo sharing on the lower left is a tool that tends to support asynchronous documentation processes that can be either individual or group oriented. And so for participation that involves content curation, as in our earlier example, this might be obviously an appropriate or useful tool. For individual consultations in an expert, in an access to expert orientation, text messaging or voice calling might be more appropriate tools to facilitate that type of participation and interaction. So this might seem obvious, but it's not just about the tools, but this whole process of plotting different tools on the landscape diagram brings people into a conversation about the kinds of participation that you want to enable and support with an initiative. And so it serves a purpose also of thinking more deeply about the kind of participation that you're interested in supporting or need to support with a particular project or initiative. This slide here shows an inventory of common digital tools that have been placed on the landscape diagram. We use this in the workshops when we're teaching this. And we look at, we use it with our stewards to look at different ways to support various modes of participation with their communities of practice. So having done the orientations and then worked on a tools landscape diagram, the next step in the process is to start to think about what platforms or tools that are out there that can support the kind of orientation and participatory modes that are best suited to what the community needs. And so very briefly, this is a sequence of images I'm going to show here from one of our tech stewards workbooks as they carried out the activity. And it shows them identifying the tools from the inventory. You can see here they're circling tools based on the project orientation up here at the top. And in this case, they've circled quite a few tools. And we would typically work with them at this stage to then take a closer look at that range of tools to see if it could be narrowed down or further refined. The next step after they've done that is then choosing an acquisition strategy. So we've created a series of worksheets where they can answer a series of questions related to each of the technology acquisition strategies, which helps them to narrow down their range of choices in deciding which way they're going to proceed. So in this case, it's the use what you have strategy. You can see at the top, there's questions like, what are community members already using in their daily lives? Can you repurpose an existing platform or make a small adjustments to it for for your purposes? Are there skills gaps in the community that prevent an existing platform from supporting what you need to do? And will using the platform add costs to your community members? And so each of the acquisition strategies has a series of questions. They go through it. And as I say, typically with our groups, they fall into a use what you have strategy, but it's possible that one of the other strategies might be actually useful to them. Having done that, then we move to a further activity where they match the tools with an inventory of platforms that fall under the use what you have acquisition strategy. So here now they're taking their tools inventory and matching it up with different platforms that include those tool sets. And then they conduct a comparative evaluation of the platforms that include the tools they need. So sometimes there's more than one platform that could be potentially used. And so we have a series of questions that look at the fitness of the platform, the integration with other platforms, performance, pricing, vendor support, security, and other considerations. And that helps them to rank the possible choices across various categories and to make a decision that they can take to the community for discussion. So that whole series of steps leads them eventually to a platform choice or a narrower choice that they can then take to the community. And what they would typically do is roll that out in a small scale implementation with a platform and evaluate it as a pilot. And we typically call this a campaign in our work. And in doing that, they begin to then assess whether the tool is doing what it wants to do. And then if it is, they can expand its use with the community. If it's not doing what they want it to do, then they would do an evaluation of it and look at other alternative platforms, try to understand why it's not working or what the issues are, and then go back to their planning process to look at other potential tools or platforms. So the stewardship training workbook and the downloadable worksheets are available actually as an open educational resource in our ebook at this link up here at the top. You could just Google tech stewardship workbook, and I think it'll show up near the top of the Google search results. Although you never know what shows up in your Google search results, depending on what you've been looking at. But we are continuing to work on and improve the material going forward. So this is a work in progress. And really, I just want to say in summary that the intent here is just to provide a kind of high-level overview of some of these techniques that we use to clarify, what participation might mean in a given setting, to map out the dynamics of that participation as a series of communicative interactions, and then how to then apply that insight to identify and narrow down a range of digital tools that can potentially support it. And then the actual execution of that and the choice of the tools is obviously the next more detailed step, which we won't get into in my presentation. So that concludes my comments. Thank you very much again, Dr. Chowdhury, for the opportunity to present this.
Thank you, Gordon, for your very interesting presentation. Now I'd like to invite Professor Helen Hambly from School of Environmental Design and Rural Development, University of Guelph, to participate in this session as discussant with Dr. Gordon Gao. While Dr. Hambly starts conversation with Dr. Gordon Gao, please do not forget to ask questions using the link shared in the chat box. We like to address the most important questions from the audience. Please, Hambly, questions or comments?
Well, thank you very much, Gordon and Adarahul. I understand as the first discussant, I'm going to have 10 minutes maximum, so I want to be really to the point. But I can't help but start with a reflection, Gordon, because as this process and these tools were developed for the first time in Sri Lanka, I was having the privilege to work with you there. And it's wonderful to see how this has become a rolling learning experience with new generations of the designs and the processes that go along with them. So it's exciting to hear your presentation. So the thing that I want to really focus on to start with, I have two points. Is the first one is that we had the tremendous privilege of being in field work, doing, working through these tools like the spidergram, like the landscape design, like the worksheets, and these, immense interaction and documentation face to face with participants, not just with the technology stewardships who are in like a training of trainers environment of social learning and value creation, but in the communities themselves. And we visited a number of communities in Sri Lanka. Now, of course, with COVID, we're in the virtual world. So we have this layering of a digital or mediated social learning and communication experience. So could you reflect a little bit about how these tools and processes might be adapted to fit a virtual extension or a virtual interaction?
That's a great question. And it's a difficult one because, as you say, a lot of it requires a lot of rich kind of social engagement to make these activities useful, relevant, meaningful. And so I'm not sure exactly what the best approach is going forward because we're not quite at that point yet. However, my thoughts are that some of it can be done using, whiteboarding technology, for instance. Some of it can be done using, Google Forms, even, where you can take somebody through a series of questions and answers that have a decision tree type component to them. And those are all very useful, I think, but I don't think you could necessarily extend that directly into the community itself. I think ultimately it has to be with the tech steward or somebody like that who is still present in the community and still has that whether it's face-to-face or socially distanced arrangement. I think in the context of Sri Lanka in particular, there's just no way you can deliver this directly to smallholders at the farm level. The technology is not there. So can you equip a steward to be able to liaise with a team, say, back at the University of Paradinia or in Canada, as they're going into the field to work with the community directly, maybe using a digital device to capture some of this and then sharing it with other tech stewards. But my thinking on it is that that's really the only way to do it, a kind of a hybrid approach. Otherwise, I just don't see how those techniques can be meaningful or even carried out given the resource constraints.
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things that we're learning in these really challenging times of living our life online because we can't be together is that participation, we took it for granted that it was a synchronous and in-person interaction. And now we're really challenged to think about what happens with asynchronous interactions and then this further layering of media and digital interfaces. So I entirely agree with you. I don't think there's any sort of secrets here right now to success. It's going to be trial and error and more social learning communication around this. So thank you. And then,
Helen, we have a question from audience. Maybe we can take one question.
Sure.
So how do you ensure the knowledge shared in community of practice is not impacted by agricultural misinformation? Gordon?
Well, that's your area of interest, isn't it? That's a great question. I don't know if you can ensure it. I think it's part of that conversation, and it's something we haven't done directly with the tech steward training yet. But again, setting up, looking at the community orientations and the nature of the participation. Is Is it an open community where there's a free flow of ideas? Is it a moderated community? Is it a community that's got very controlled set of procedures or filtering process or a vetting process for posts? So if you look at Wikipedia as kind of, the most open possible community you could really think about as a kind of an exemplar, there are things, various soft security measures and moderation techniques that you could employ to be able to identify that. And if you were sophisticated enough, as they are on Wikipedia, and you're using an open source type framework, you can even build some automation into that to do it as well. But I think you have to bootstrap the community first before we get to that issue. But I think coming back to the orientations, if you're saying, is this really about access to trusted expertise, or is this an open discussion with everybody? What's our priority here? And if trusted information is the priority, then you might want to think about, that orientation to access to expertise versus, say, an open discussion.
Thank you, Katherin. Helen, please go ahead with your
So this might fit well with the idea that misinformation includes some type of power and power relation and perturbation, or a desire to interfere and upset. So with misinformation. So my question, Gordon, about the landscape design. This is the tool where the mapping of different digital opportunities are laid against that 2x2 type of matrix. So you have on one side the interaction, on the other side the polar opposite is what you call documentation, and then synchronous and asynchronous. So in that diagram that you showed us, the term documentation is used. But in my understanding of Wenger's work and in the community of practice literature, there is a distinction between reification, which is this horrible term, and documentation. Mm-hmm. Because reification means that it's something really intangible in communication and in participatory processes and in power that is being captured as a material thing. And I'm concerned that documentation is not the best word anymore, that there is something else about reification that takes these sort of intangible things, makes them material. And that process of making something material, including codifying tacit knowledge, is an act of power. And mm-hmm. Who gets to keep that power? Who has that editorial control in documentation? What gets written down, what doesn't get written down? So could you just comment on power in relationship to the processes that you discussed? I know it's a huge topic.
Well, thank you for that, and I thank you for bringing up that distinction. You're right. Yeah, reification is the term that's actually used by Wenger, and and thank you for pointing out it's a much more theoretically complex idea. We adopted documentation for the training materials, not necessarily to oversimplify it, but obviously in the context of training extension officers, we thought reification might be just a little bit too much to try to load up in a 2-day workshop. But I think you're right. So it's things like embedded. It's like the tacit knowledge and how the governance of the community of practice itself, right, can be embedded tacitly and reified, right? This is how we do things, and it was, and maybe that wasn't shaped by everybody. That was shaped by maybe a strong-willed individual. So the role of power here is really important, and what we try to do in the training is emphasize with the tech stewards that, and this is part of a much larger issue, as you'll know, is not that your job is to convince everybody that this is the best way to go, but to facilitate a conversation, to try to build some kind of sense of consensus around what we want to do as a community. And then to say, let's see if these digital technologies can enhance what we want to do or help us to achieve our goal. And but let's be agnostic about it. And if it's not working, let's try to understand why it's not working. And we also try to emphasize this idea that some practices will be digitally resistant. There's no way that the community wants to adopt digital technology. So we try to stress that with the stewards as well. Be respectful of digital resistant practices. Try to understand with the community members, what's going on here, but don't try to force something that clearly isn't a good fit with the community. And so I like to think about, when we talk about digital agriculture, I like to think about this term digitalization in agriculture, which is an incremental building of a pathway. It's not setting out a preordained vision that we're trying to achieve. We're going to build this pathway in incremental visions as we learn about what works and what doesn't for us. And so I envision a future where you have communities with these mosaics of how they use technology. It could be quite different between different communities because it has to mesh well with their social practices that are already established. So we haven't solved the problem, but we're aware of it, and we try to bring that foregrounded in the training as part of a conversation with the stewards. Also recognizing that a lot of stewards are extension officers who are under pressure from their organizations to enact a vision. And so they may be working between two different sort of political tensions here, right? What the community wants to do and what they're told they have to try to get the community to do. So this is part of the ongoing research as well, to understand a little bit more about that power dynamic. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we are running out of time. We can take another question from the audience. I think it's a very interesting question, and question related to also other topic we discussed. Why the choice to use the word steward? And also, do you find that you have any struggles in translating this concept into non-Western context?
Yeah, thanks, Katherin. That's a great question. So we just adopted the term directly from the Wenger, White, and Smith book. I like it in working in the agricultural context because stewardship, the sense of stewardship is already kind of ingrained in that discourse. And in Sri Lanka, actually, surprisingly, it seems like it gets pretty good reception even in Sri Lanka. The term seems to be understood fairly easily. I would like to be able to, in the future, find maybe Sinhalese and a Tamil terms that may resonate more with the farmers themselves, but that's an ongoing sort of effort that we haven't really worked with. I do know when we were translating some of the material into Sinhalese that there was a lot of back and forth around what communities of practice concept was, and they had a hard time translating that into a meaningful phrase in the workbooks.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you.
With that, I like to conclude our presentation and discussion part one. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me to thank both our speakers and discussants for their wonderful conversation and thought-provoking discussion. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, now I like to invite Dr. Katherin Reilly for her presentation. Dr. Katherin Reilly is Associate Professor in the School of Communication at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Her work centers on ICT4D, C4D, and with particular focus on Latin America. She is co-editor with Matthew Smith of the book Open Development Network Innovation in International Development, published by MIT Press in 2015, and co-editor with Anil Hira of a special issue of the Journal of Developing Societies on Platform Economy in 2017. She is currently PI of a Shark IDRC partnership grant, which is creating participatory citizen data audit and self-appraisal techniques to build citizen data literacy in the platform economy. These techniques are being implemented by 5 digital rights organizations located in Chile, Colombia, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay. Welcome, Dr. Reilly, and you're set to go for the presentation.
Thank you. Oh, it's telling me that I can't share my screen while the other participant is sharing.
I think. Can you share it now?
Yep. Here we go. All right. Thank you very much, Tirol. It's a real pleasure to join this group today. I wasn't at the first session, and actually I contacted Tirol and said it wasn't at a time of day when I could attend. I'm in the extreme west of Canada. And that started the conversation that brought me into the group and to this presentation today. What I'm going to share are some thoughts. There's some sort of initial thoughts about how we might rethink assumptions about participation in the digital age. And I've gathered together 4 assumptions. Some of these actually come from reviewing the recording of Dr. Ricardo Ramirez's presentation in the first session for this process. And they also come from my own experiences and my background in communication for development and things like that. So I'm going to share these 4 assumptions and talk about what they are, and then I will share some rethinks. And then at the end, I'm going to share a very brief example of the implications of this difference as it has manifested in the work that I'm doing right now on community data audits and self-appraisal. So I'm going to dive right into it. And the first assumption that I want to talk about is the idea that participation is a discrete process that has a clear, or should have a clear convener and objective with a beginning, middle, and end, and a clear goal, and that goal revolves in some way around optimizing or legitimizing an outcome, such as a plan or a decision. And I would like to suggest that this sort of broad assumption within the participatory literature reflects a history of development communication. Here I'm drawing some examples from Colin Sparks' work on development communication, where in the early days of development communication, of course, it's quite top-down, and it's based on a mass communication strategy, and the ideas and the processes are emanating from the state. And the response from people working in more participatory approaches is to try and start not from the state and its needs, but from an underprivileged community perhaps, or a social problem identified in the community, and the articulation of what that need is, and its transmission through various mediated and political channels to the state to communicate those needs. So there's obviously this discussion within the participatory literature about a very top-down versus a very bottom-up approach. What I want to suggest is that this reflects a broader logic, a kind of an ontology, if you will, about how social relations are organized within communities or within countries. And what I want to suggest is that this is a reflection of a set of assumptions around hegemonic cultural logics. Here I'm drawing this diagram from Martín Barbero, who's a Colombian communication scholar who's quite famous. And I think that it reflects this idea where you have logics of production on the one hand of communicative content and logics of consumption on the other. And that those logics of production reflect particular institutional arrangements and technical arrangements that manifest in particular cultural matrices and industrial logics. And on the other hand, logics of consumption reflect particular social processes and ritual processes, which can also influence those cultural matrices and industrial forms. And we can think of, therefore, this idea of top-down communication as coming from the particular institutionality and technical arrangements of a logic of production, and participatory approaches as trying to invert this and saying, we need to have industrial forms and cultural matrices reflect the logics of social processes and ritual processes, and the institutionality and technical arrangements support that rather than the reverse. So there's nothing wrong with any of this. It's all completely logical. But the thing that I want to suggest, and this is drawing on Martin Barbero again, is that that logic, that underlying ontology has perhaps shifted in the digital age. And this is indeed what Martin Barbero suggests as well, that in digital times where the internet breaks apart our experience of time and our experience of space, and we have the breakdown of borders and global flows, et cetera, communication, sort of our underlying ontology can be changed. And so Martin Barbero proposes this alternative vision in which what is happening is that technical arrangements, we could think of algorithms, for example, are organized in ways that set up our networking and dictate narrations. And on the other hand, we experience those technical arrangements through our sensations, and those sensations underlie the articulations of our identities and our citizenship. And together, those two things start to form our experience of time and also the constitution or the construction of spaces. So this blows apart that hegemonic cultural logic where the legitimacy of processes is embedded in, class structures and things like that, and that participatory processes are, meant to legitimate a decision-making process that is embedded in the state, say, and opens up the possibility that, in fact, the goal is quite different. It's not about the legitimation of a decision, but rather about, say, the synchronization of groups of people into particular spatial and temporal constructions so that they can articulate identities and citizenships within networks given particular narrations. And I think it's important to recognize that these types of processes will be quite layered and multiple, and there may be multiple conveners and objectives. So this leads me to a second assumption from the participatory literature. And here I've literally grabbed a little chunk of Dr. Ramirez's presentation from a few months back. This very useful lining up of Cheryl Arnstein's ladder of participation and other contributions to this. Indeed, Colin Sparks has yet another iteration of this. It's a much repeated vision of participation. And basically what you see here is the idea that that there is an ideal vision of how participation ought to be, that it is often at the bottom of the ladder, very shallow, very narrow. It is manipulative or passive or compliance building. And so we have some definitions here. The aim is to educate. The goal is to achieve public support through public relations, or people are being told what has been decided or what has already happened, or that tasks are assigned, but the agenda and the process is directed by outsiders. And so the idea is to move away from that sort of top-down model and towards citizen control or self-mobilization or collective action that's driven from below. But if we follow the ontology, the alternative ontology offered by Martin Barbero, participation actually becomes much more relative and relational. And it becomes about a process of understanding individual positionalities and relations of power that are built on intersectionalities within a given context and social location. What I'd like to point out here is that it is entirely possible to achieve self-mobilization or collective action or citizen control, which are these sort of top layer visions of participation. It's entirely possible to achieve these and also sustain unhealthy relations of power within communities. And so I think that's one thing to keep in mind. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if the goal is synchronization, so that you can constitute identities and constitute citizen groups, then it might not be necessary to achieve those ideas of collective action and citizen control over a decision-making process. The fact that you've constituted an identitary group and a citizen group may be achieving the objective in and of itself. The third assumption that I wanted to share is that participation is a technology, and here the idea is that the best practices of participatory intervention themselves constitute in technological interventions. And that's a way of thinking about it that I think also reflects that more cultural hegemony logic, because if we shift to a post-hegemonic ontology, we would look at participation as a social process that is mediated. And so it's not about the technology itself, but about the processes of mediation that affect the flow of social processes. And that mediation can take place in a lot of different ways. It can take place through culture, through language, through ritual, through facilitation techniques, or best practices in like some of the ones that maybe Dr. Gao shared with us earlier today, as well as institutions. And when we think about social media in particular, we have to be really aware of the unique mediative characteristics of these technologies. So we could think of, for example, the fact that many of these technologies are prosumptive in nature, that they allow people to both consume and produce ideas at the same time, and that the way the technology mediates that process of prosumption will actually dictate the type of knowledge that is produced out of those interactions within that community, and therefore the way that identities are expressed and citizenship is constructed, and how those things come together into an experience of urbanization or of ruralness, or spatial construction, and also experiences of time. So here I have a few quotes that talks in particular about this issue of recursive mediation, which is basically what I just described, that media today mediates the conditions of mediation, from Hansen, or that information and data do not just capture, but now actually constitute everyday life, or directly that social media is a social factory. It constructs our cultural experience. So how do best practices, this raises questions like, how do best practices in participation recursively mediate outcomes? Or how do social media mediate participatory mediation? And what does this all mean for the achievement of synchronization? And then the fourth and final assumption I wanted to share is the assumption that stakeholders are rational and autonomous. So something that Dr. Ramirez shared in his presentation a few months back is this idea from Mitchell et al. That if you're trying to select the stakeholders in a participatory process that has a particular decision-making outcome, those stakeholders should be individuals or groups which have two of three things, that they have two of three of these things, which are power, legitimacy, and urgency vis-a-vis a clearly defined issue. And that they can clearly articulate their interest in that issue, and that they come to the table ready to represent their needs or desires. And here I want to suggest that we need to take into consideration the extent to which stakeholders are also affective and mediated. First of all, the fact that social media becomes another actor at the table, in effect, because of the way in which it recursively mediates the production of knowledge within these spaces. So power can become algorithmic, legitimacy is the power to convoke networks, and urgency can be manipulated through narration. And this, I think, would really complicate the selection of the true stakeholders to a particular process, participatory process. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is that feelings can trump reason if we think of participatory processes as being effective, that feeling included, for example, may be as or more important than substantial outcomes, or that apathy, for example, might take on a particular significance. So to finish up, I just wanted to share a very quick example of how this thinking has come to influence some of the work that I'm doing. So I do work on citizen data audits. So it transpires that in the platform economy in many countries around the world, privacy regulations give citizens the right to know what personal data a private company holds about them. So very much in the tradition of participatory rural appraisal or participatory citizen audits in general, I thought, okay, this is really interesting. So if citizens ask for access to the data that companies have about them, then they could use that stream of information to audit the company and see how that company is using the personal data. And is that company using this data resource? Is the company stewarding that data resource in a way that serves the community? And so citizen data audits in this vision of things are a form of participatory appraisal or community audit of a third party from outside of the company that is doing an act. And the goal is to evaluate how platform industries contribute to society through their use of personal data resources. And the process makes transparent the institutionality and the technical arrangements of the logics of production. So here again, I'm drawing on that ontology provided by Martin Barbero, that first ontology. But when we carried out this process, we found that ultimately citizens were ending up simply auditing whether companies were following the law as it was established by the government, and that there was a lot more going on in their experiences with how personal data entered into their relationship with companies, that they were actually in a very complex relationship with these companies in which data was flowing back and forth. And so after a lot of reflection with the partners in the field and a lot of conceptual work, we started to shift towards this alternative view of things, which we are very tentatively calling self-appraisal of data acts. And here the difference is that we are pursuing a form of participatory re-signification of a socially mediated process from inside of that process. So rather than seeing the company as somewhere over there and the data is being shipped to the company and the company is using it and it's having effects on us, the idea is that we are in a relationship with that company and there's data flowing back and forth, and that we can engage in a re-signification of that process. So the goal then becomes to be self-aware of how you share personal data resources and how that produces community and culture. And the outcome is to make transparent the ways in which technical arrangements, narrations, and networks are shaping space and time with implications for identity and citizenship. So that is it from me. And I'm really interested to hear the comments and questions.
Great. Thank you, Katherin. Very interesting presentation. Now I like to invite the Firoze along to participate in this session as discussant with Dr. Katherin Reilly. Firoze is a doctoral student at the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development, University of Guelph. While Firoze starts conversation with Dr. Katherin Reilly, please do not forget to ask questions using the link shared in the chat box. We like to address the most important questions from you. Firoze, we can start the conversation.
Thank you, Professor Chaudhary. Thank you, Dr. Reilly. It was a very compelling presentation. I mean, I have a ton of questions, for the interest of time. I don't know if I can, address all of that. So I'm going to start with the first assumption that you have mentioned based on hegemonic cultural logic and post-hegemonic cultural logic. I'm going to use Marxist interpretation to understand the dialectical social relationship. So if we want to understand the dialectical social relationship, the capitalist mode of production is and always has been computational, because capital, what it does, it constantly computes and calculates to categorize, to produce and reproduce social inequality. Otherwise, it cannot produce surpluses. So from that point of argument, if we see that right now, because of the rise of digital capitalism or platform capitalism, however we name it, we see emergence of dialectical data relation, where you have one groups of entity like Google and Facebook. Their growth essentially depends on the data of people. So our life becomes a steady source of data, for facilitating the growth of this, technology companies. So from that argument, when Marx in 1848, way before the advent of personal computer, looked at this dialectical social relationship for social, extraction, capital extraction, is it anything new what we are seeing right now? Do we need a post-hegemonic logic, or we can go back to good old Marxist interpretation of data relations?
So I think there's two things that having a post-hegemonic logic can do for us. So one of them is to decentralize the source of cultural power. And so there is a tendency in Marxist thought to, well, and perhaps it reflects a real world situation, to see culture as being controlled from a particular place. And so I think that a post-hegemonic logic helps us to understand that that cultural logic flows all around us. So one of the things that I like to say about this is that we all understand that Trump is an idiot. Everybody does, and that's not what's going on. And if we had a hegemonic culture, we would all, the assumption then is that we have all come to believe in what Trump is saying, but nobody actually believes what he is saying. So something else has to be going on there to make us all come, or to make certain people come together around what he's saying. And for me, it's very hard to argue that people would reasonably adopt that way of thinking about things. There has to be something else going on. So post-hegemonic logic says that these processes must be happening differently. There's two other things I want to say, though, about your approach to thinking about this. One of them is that you have assumed that platforms are taken up in the community in the way that platforms intend. And so I think here we can start to say, within communities, people are taking up these algorithmic logics in ways that the algorithms never intended. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind. And the other is that and I did this for sure in the beginning, there is a tendency within a Marxist logic to treat the data itself as a commodity and to forget that, for example, in the humanities and in anthropology and in other spaces, data is never, it wouldn't be seen as a commodity. Our identity would be seen as something that is not a commodity. For many cultures around the world, you can't commodify an identity, you just simply can't. First Nations peoples in Canada, for example, will say that if I give you my name, I'm giving you a responsibility for my personhood. And so it can't be seen in transactional terms. And so there are lots of ways that we can pull apart some of these Marxist ways of thinking about things, which isn't to say that they don't provide us with a really sophisticated understanding of productive processes and the ways in which they organize cultural space or influence the organization of cultural space. But it is to say that there may be other things going on as well.
Yeah. You mentioned, you touched on something incredibly important to understand. I have my own conflict with Marxist interpretation of things. I do see its value, but I take things with a grain of salt. Your fourth assumption in terms of something incredibly important in terms of affect, understanding, emotion, is that so one of the ways that, probably galvanizing social spaces these days, when you mentioned that Trump, I don't think Trump is essentially anything unique, what is happening around the world. And if you look at the global rise of the right, if you see around the world that how the affect is being weaponized for political gain, I think a lot of the times scholars, from psychology or scholars from a communication field, a lot of the times, they do recognize it, but at times, let's say a scholar like, David Freelon, he would say that, okay, so if you think about the social media spaces, what is the economic calculus or the political arithmetic that actually manipulates or maximizes people's engagement, in the social media spaces? We often do not always point to the, actually identify that the rise of global income inequality, the neoliberalization of the world, and hence the underlying reasons, economic marginalization, political disenfranchisement, it is facilitating the affective weaponization of information. You have identified correctly that identity cannot be commodified in the earlier scholarship, but one thing, some scholars would say that neoliberals' capacity of commodifying almost all aspects of human life. Scholars like Tim Wu would say, okay, our consciousness is being colonized for capitalist, extraction. Scholars like, the surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff would say, okay, so how the whole, human being is now not only mediated, it's actually architected to some extent that basically the entire certainty for producing surplus. So my question is, how do we actually relate to affective weaponization of information in a global scale that directly shows the connection of neoliberal assault that commodifies almost every aspect of our life, including our emotions?
I really like this observation, and I like that you've pushed me to clarify some of my thinking, which is really great. So that's one way of saying that I need to go back to the drawing board and rethink some of what you said. I think the idea with self-appraisal, we're really reflecting on some of the movements that are happening in Latin America. So for example, there's a really powerful feminist movement happening in Latin America where a lot of the discussion has revolved around mobilization through online means. And there's a big discussion around sorority, sororidad, and the idea here is sisterhood. Basically, it's a little more complicated than that, but in terms of online spaces, there's a lot of discussion about constructing authentic relationships, right? So moving away from mobilizing affect in this kind of toxic way, right? Like we're just being yanked. We're having our chains yanked and it's causing us to have an emotional reaction, rather than building relationships within communities and synchronizing relationships in communities around citizenship, expressions of citizenship and expressions of identity that are meaningful to us and that constitute the types of spaces that we want to have, right? So there is a logic, again, of flipping that relationship between the people in the position of power and the people in the positions of less power, and saying we are going to empower ourselves to respond and participate in the construction of these spaces in ways that are purposeful and meaningful for us, just as in a hegemonic logic that was going on. But I think, as you've just pointed out, it has to happen in new and different ways. It has to happen through recognizing our affective tendencies and then saying, well, how do we harness these for our own purposes rather than having our chains yanked and being reactive, right? There's a reason why meditation in Buddhism has become so popular in the world today. It's because people are saying, oh, how do I limit my reactive self and be more self-reflective in what I'm doing? And it's, I think, a reaction to the way our affect is constantly being pulled on in these spaces, as you rightly point out. And I also want to point out that the right is not the only actor who's guilty of doing this. I think that across the political spectrum, people have been guilty of yanking on people's affect and in ways that are not necessarily constructive. And so that self-appraisal is about kind of having participatory processes that slow things down and are reflective. The last thing I'll say, because I'm sure I'm out of time by now, is that those are very slow local processes. And unfortunately, I don't know how, this is a typical problem in critical research. You have these highly centralized technical forces that require a response from a highly decentralized, localized processes that are highly inefficient and slow. And I think that's kind of the way it is. Yeah.
Very interesting conversation. I think we are, almost out of time. So with that, I like to conclude our presentation and discussion part 2. Please join us to thank both of our speaker and discussant for the wonderful presentation and thought-provoking discussion.
Thank you. I love that you let it rain, Acknowledgement.
I love it too.
Okay, so just dear audience, looking at the time, I think we are a little bit over time. This is Friday, the day before weekend. I think we can go for at least 10 minutes luxury for overtime, and I'm sure, well, hopefully you're enjoying the conversation. and presentation with our amazing speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, now I'd like to invite our last presenter, Dr. Habib Ali, for his presentation. Dr. Ali is currently serving as an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies and Journalism at the University of Liberal Arts, Bangladesh. He obtained his Ph.D. in Public Relations from Griffith University, Australia. His current research and teaching focus is based on communication campaign, crisis communication, and digital media. Welcome, Dr. Habib. You're set to present for today, for the last presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Athar, for inviting me to be a part in this intellectual platform to deliver something from my country. And it will be a great pleasure and it's an honor for me as well to be with Professor Gordon Grove, Professor Katherin, and Dr. Athar and the other fellows. My name is Dr. Habib and already have been introduced. So I just present my presentation a little bit, give me time. Can you see it, please? Just respond me. Is that okay?
Yes, Dr. Ali, we can see it.
Okay, that's great. So today's title of the presentation is given their remote and online community engagement tools for building community resilience during COVID-19. It is an insight into Rupantar's initiatives in Bangladesh. So the presentation has been developed from the data of an ongoing study on an NGO's digital strategy and continuing social engagement during COVID-19 to online community using development communication approach. This particular NGO, along with other NGOs in Bangladesh, are also using digital methods and teams to fight COVID-19, to raise awareness about the issues and to engage the community in order to make them resilient during this crisis. They're trying to use the edutainment strategy in their messaging, which in particular trying to create an agenda, a public agenda in this communication process. It will be discussed very soon. So first, I would like to talk about community resilience, which can be defined as the capacity intentionally developed by communities to respond to and influence change, sustain and renew the community and develop new trajectories for the future so that they can thrive in changing environment. Here, NGO is serving as an actor side by side with the government and other actors. They're serving as supportive and changing agents to prepare the community to address real problem and crisis. I would like to say a model that has been used in Singapore as well, in the third world as well. So it's given by Chandra and their fellows. It's a little bit broader. So just I would like to see how the NGOs are serving with the government, side by side with the government, in order to create awareness, social connectedness, such as social cohesion and response and recovery, in particular in a time of disaster. So the most important thing is that the level of community resilience depends on wellness, access, education, engagement, self-sufficiency, partnerships. From the NGO's perspective, they're trying to educate the people to create engagement by the use of effective risk communication approaches, the information through different disseminated through different digital media strategies, so that the audience can understand the team's message about the technical team's message about prevention of COVID-19 and apply them in the reality. I have made by my own in my handwriting, sorry for that because I didn't have much time. So how the NGO are actually operating during COVID-19, their communication process is given in a nutshell here. That NGO is serving as a source that is explained in agenda setting theory, that someone, maybe organizations, maybe media, communicate their information to their audience, to the target audience in a particular time, a particular situation, and the message are designed in that way. So during COVID-19, the message had been prepared from risk communication approach particularly, and the messages are developed in such a way so that they're informed about their coping strategies in order to address the crisis, in particular during COVID-19. And it comes from a crisis management theory, sometimes crisis management approach, sometimes the knowledge from the crisis management and risk communication areas as well. So for what we say, what we find, the digital strategy, in particular, they're using YouTube and Facebook, will be later on discussed. And the YouTube, the contents are made on folk media and the narrative speech in a manner of edutainment as strategy. And you know about the application of entertainment to educate people. And in particular, they're trying to create an agenda among the public about the prevention of COVID-19. So the audience are comprising of the community members, of the particular community members of that particular NGO. And what are the impacts? There is the social cohesions. First, I would like to say they're creating awareness about the situation and how they will address it, the collectivity, the collective knowledge, their wisdom as well, and the knowledge from the outside scientific sources like WHO, like CDC, like local health organizations, what they're saying, and then NGO is rectifying and particular information that the audience need in order to address it. At a time, we have a particular social capital and network that are also built upon on this communication, and it is facilitated through the NGO, which in turn create community resilience. So I would like to talk about the community resilience, the NGO's information first. That the name of the NGO is Rupantar, and it's the name Bengali name. Its English will be the Social Transformations. It's a non-profit organization that has been working in the field of development in Bangladesh since 1995. And it has 5 programmatic areas: democracy and political empowerment, peace and tolerance, disaster management and climate change adaptation, children and youth rights, popular media and folk theater. So somewhere disaster management, climate change adaptation will include the COVID-19 preventive strategy, also falls on the popular media and folk theater, their programs are. So the pandemic has led the NGO to focus more on the use of digital methods exponentially, because most people during COVID-19 communicate and network through digital media. It is all over the world that people are relying more on social media network to communicate to communicate the message related to their everyday lives. The NGO use YouTube channels, they are developing folk media, folk songs, informational narratives, and they're being disseminated in a transitional manner. And later on, these YouTube's video are also promoted through Facebook, some discussions, some printed materials about raising awareness about COVID-19 and social issues that impacting communities during this pandemic. So I would like to just give a focus on the major themes that are promoted through YouTube during the COVID-19 period, in particular to address the crisis. The first thing that the NGO are communicating through their YouTube channel is on using health hygiene and measures to prevent COVID-19 COVID-19 mass transmission, such as using hand washing, social distancing, masking. Those are the primary things, and if necessary, going for quarantine and social isolation as well. The second is important. Making our people about misinformation, disinformation, or even rumor and hate speech that is trying to sensationalize the information over environment, or communicative environment during this pandemic. And Rupantar NGO is trying to our people about the misinformation and its impact as well during this crisis. And third, the most important, I also think it's a unique in a particular like NGO that working Rupantar is different from all NGOs, that they're also trying to focus on the repatriating expatriate workers, such as Bangladeshi workers working overseas, and they're returning to Bangladesh during COVID-19. So there is impact over that expatriate workers, such as local people try to discriminate them, bully them, and I mean the outcast also sometimes. And Rupantar has taken an initiative to make people aware, to normalize the situation, to stop the discrimination against those returning expatriate workers. And in their message, they're trying to inform and educate people to make normal behavior, to support them for quarantine and other available necessary items that they can be fully 42 weeks quarantine takes place in a normal way. And what was reported also that during any crisis, health situation, disaster, maybe even COVID-19 or maybe tornado, cyclone, what impacted. Another group of people highly impacted is women and children. And during COVID-19, we have seen the women and children are also ostracized, and the frontline workers are also discriminated and bullied as well. And how to say, so they're discriminated by the people, by the local people, who are, less aware about community awareness, about community solidarity, about the importance of those people in our life. So Rupantar in their message has tried to aware people about the importance of women and children, about the frontline workers, and their contribution, in particular the women's contribution in the society, that they have tried to put in front, that in their message, that people should remember it, and in that way they should do an equitable and using the normal behavior with them, such as not to do any kind of discrimination with any kind of this. And in that, the message also, they have tried to put a theme about stopping child marriage, that the people are getting poor, maybe they don't have income, so there is a chance of dropout of the female children, and maybe they are getting the victim of child marriage. So they have also made our people so that they never go in that process. The children need to be educated after the pandemic is over. And the second the last two themes is are based on they're trying to put their focus on the audience of having nutritious food to make their health strong. In particular, the immune system should be strong to address this COVID-19 virus, such as they have put emphasis of eating fruits, vegetables, good foods, such as vitamin-oriented foods, milk, and meat, red meat, wherever necessary to make the immune system good. They also have instructed to have light exercise wherever necessary, and the importance of sleep during this pandemic. A major thing that happened in Bangladesh in last May, that the Amphan cyclone hit Bangladesh, and Rupantar also took initiative people to make aware how to take safe shelter during the cyclone. It is there were two crises hit at a time in Bangladesh, and Rupantar tries to make people aware how they can take shelter properly during that crisis, even in line with the COVID-19 as well, so that they can take their masks, they can take their all necessary stuffs, and if someone is infected or maybe with symptoms, he should take care of himself by him in a different room. So these are the masses have been actually transported, disseminated through their digital media. So a question may arise: how does online entertainment create an agenda for supporting community? We already talked about the application by me, that the agenda setting theory, that media and communication source set their story according to the objective. Of course, here the NGOs, the objectives are to provide social, humanitarian, communicative support in the context of preventing COVID-19. And these objectifies their messages. As a source, they're promoting the message about COVID-19 prevention through YouTube and Facebook to make a topic of discussions. So people should think about this properly, and about the prevention strategies, about masking, about social distancing, about hand washing. So it is the main agenda of Rupantar's, as well as I have already discussed some major themes should be applied by the people to make people community resilient to address the crisis. So what I find that it is participatory. The NGOs overall communicative activities could be described under the theme of participatory communication, under the theory of participatory communication. But in particular, during this period, it is very difficult to say whether it is participatory or not, because audience engagement is not measured, and very difficult to say whether it is audience or not in their communicative materials. Most of the times, it is like information flow, created by the source of the NGO. So it's the kind of informational support to develop their coping strategies, to educate people about the surrounding problems during COVID-19 and how they can address it. What I have found that they have also tried to use the local context and themes in the YouTube videos, the local languages, so that people can get it easily. However, we can assume that digital media in a context of Banos are playing a complementary role to support the NGOs, other media and communication strategy work for social transformation in Bangladeshi communities during the pandemic restrictions. In my concluding remarks, I can also say that digital media had still a significant role, greater role to play in both developed and developing countries to create collective awareness and solidarity. Because we are unable to go outside, but we have still inbuilt social capital, social relations, community relations, and it can be nurtured by the use of digital media, everyday interactions, and YouTube, Facebook, the Instagram as well, and they're playing a vital role to glue this collectiveness every day. And the Rupantar NGO is trying to use the two media such as YouTube and Facebook to create a collective awareness of solidarity among the community to make the people resilient, to make the community resilient so that they can bounce back to the situation, functioning state, normal situation after the COVID-19 is over. This is that they're trying, and the existing social network may be more concrete, more aligned, and the NGO, it is not only what I say that the community is getting the information, it's getting the coping strategy and learning so many things. It is the NGO is also trying to develop its capacity to deliver something new during this pandemic, because COVID-19 is as a crisis, as a risk, posing a new threat to the community, in particular the village, the city, and local and global arena as well. So thank you all. This is my presentation that I did. If you have any question, you can ask me, please. I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. You can stop sharing your presentation, and very interesting presentation, and it's really fascinating to see how an NGO, Rupantar, is helping for building community resiliency using digital tools. Can you please stop sharing the slide? Yeah. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Tirol to participate in this session as a discussant with Dr. Habib Ali. Dr. Tirol is Associate Professor and the Dean of College of Development Communication of the University of the Philippines, Los Banos. While Dr. Tirol starts conversation with Dr. Ali, please do not forget to ask questions using the link, share in the chat box. We like to address the most important questions from you.
It's actually a very early good morning here in the Philippines. It's 12:30 a.m. So I hope I was able to listen very well and still awake for this discussion. The presentation is very clear in terms of the use of social media in building community resilience and identifying the messages or the topics to lead towards this building of community resilience, and using edutainment as the approach for presenting the messages. What strikes me as very interesting in this presentation is the application of agenda setting. Agenda setting originally started with mass media, particularly newspaper, right? So it was the writer, the columnist, who normally set the agenda by prioritizing news in the newspaper such that it influences the readers to think in a particular way about that topic or that concern. But in the case of social media, I think the use of agenda setting is not yet much explored. And I am thinking that Facebook and YouTube have different qualities as compared with the newspaper, right? Because in YouTube and Facebook, there is interaction, right? Interaction is allowed, is still possible. Even if, let's say, YouTube or Facebook communicates messages about good nutrition for COVID-19, or the discrimination against overseas Bangladeshi workers, etc. There is still that interaction, no, between and among the participants, where you have the reactions live, no. And so I was thinking, this gives a different setup for the agenda setting function. So do you think there is any difference in the agenda setting role or function in the context of digital tools like YouTube and Facebook? Because here we have many voices. There are different voices that could set the agenda. So it would be interesting, no, how the agenda setting theory functions in the context of digital tools. That is.
Okay, thank you so much for the question.
Yeah,
it's a good question, and I will
something
answer it. I will answer it in two segments. First, I would like to give the example. Of course, there must be some contradiction, because agenda setting theory was introduced on the impact of media in the US elections, some 1960s, Macomb and so they introduced it. So in the current time, when we think about the NGO, how they're disseminating message, how they're producing message, and how they're trying to constructing their messaging, and their in the communicative environment. If you think it, agenda setting theory also had some importance. But at the same time, because during this digital world, our communicative environment is highly fluid, highly changeable, and what we think is the internet age, the digital media landscape, in particular, it is also impacted by users' information, users' interaction that you have already introduced. So there is a chance of using, because as a PR and communication expert, I also think, as I mentioning that the field is changing, and it is the flow is highly changeable in digital media. Now it is going lockdown, so there maybe the lockdown is over, how the conversation may be changed, the way that it's being done now. So agenda setting may not be applied, or may be applied with another theory. So I have the idea of using dialogical theory, how they start dialogue with the audience, with the community, such as the NGO experts are not aware about everything what is happening in the field, because during lockdown, many people also do not have internet connectivity. The digital divide, it's very apparent in the third world. So how could I guess that all the community members are online and they're communicating with the NGO sources? So there is so one way of flow of information is noted here during this COVID-19. In particular, this is why agenda setting theory seems to be important in order to understand the current flow of communication made by Rupantar NGO. But of course, it may be changed when people try to interact more. And what happens during this digital period, the communication happens not only in offline, such as we start in offline and it ends in online. So there is a combination of online and offline interaction to create community resilience as well, which can be happened when the situation becomes normal.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Yes.
And we have an audience question. I think that's related to what we're discussing. Dr. Tirol, how can we ensure safe participation in the digital spaces in Bangladesh when the country faces draconian policies like Digital Security Act 2018? Any thought on that, Dr. Habib?
Yeah. Should I answer it?
Yeah, you can. I mean, if you like to.
Of course, from my point of view, communication expert, the NGOs, people who are working there for supporting the people, why we go in this world? I have already shown you the themes about communication during COVID-19. The laws relating to digital media doesn't affect on those kind of themes. Such as, yes, if you try to attack the government, if you try to attack someone with bullying, if you try to use misinformation, disinformation, then you'll be in trouble. The source will be in trouble. But of course, when the message is curated, you understand already that I already talked about that the message is coming from CDC, the message is coming from World Health Organization, the message is coming from government, and the source is rectifying, curating what is important, they're filtering, and then it's going to the audience. This is why I have already told agenda setting theory is applicable in order to actually interrogate or sense the current digital communication to raise awareness about COVID-19. So the laws much more not effective to impact NGOs communication during COVID-19.
Thank you, Dr. Kale.
Yes. The next thing that struck me was in the social construction. It was mentioned that photo illustrations or drawing pictures was the main tool, which to me is also something new rather than the narratives or storytelling or interview to elicit how a community or residents construe their social reality or perceive their social reality. So how do you envision using these drawings or illustrations on digital communicative environment to help achieve the goals of the digital strategy, like social cohesion, solidarity, cohesion, etc.
In fact, social constructions are the way that how they see the world, how they interpret the world. The social construction happens in two ways, such as I am saying you something, it is my social construction, and how you sense the world, it is your social construction. And in that way, meaning is created. Meaning is always dialogical and both sender and recipient oriented. So meaning is negotiated through social construction. So we need to realize it. In particular, when we try to set the agenda of something, we always try to sort out or frame something in a different way. We need to think the social consequence if we try to use something wrong about government, about some people, about some community. We need to talk about that. We need to discuss with the expert, even with the government, that we are trying to put such information, whether it has some problem or not. The social construction goes in such a way that we are trying to see COVID-19 in that way. COVID-19 is affecting our people who are coming back from outside, women and children. COVID-19 is also affecting us during cyclone. So it is quite different from other states as well. For example, the way that COVID-19 experience is experienced in the US is quite different the way we are experiencing in Bangladesh. So consequently, the NGOs are also projecting the problem in their own social constructive way and the solution as well. So it's a little bit like, developing knowledge about the prevention and about risk communication and crisis communication.
Yes, yes, because I was really more interested in using the drawings, Dr. Habib. This is something new, if you draw something to illustrate, I think to illustrate how they construct or how they understand COVID-19 issues or COVID-19 safety precautions or measures. So how far was the study already in using the drawings?
I have just started with the support. I have just started with the support of the NGOs the main activist, the NGOs CEO, and Dr. Atahar is also supporting me in that research. So it will take some time, maybe 4 or 5 months. I have been already oriented with the data and analyze the content, analyze the source, the way that they're delivering the message, the tools, so that I can write the paper. But it will take some time because I need to also construct how it can be more target oriented, in the context of COVID-19, it's more unique. So the theories may be changed or curated, maybe integrated with dialogue. I already said about those things. We are on the way.
We have some questions from audience. One is perhaps participatory communication in the pandemic might restore the primacy of the spoken word. Are our peoples actually oral cultures? What do you think?
Are our people actually oral cultures? Yeah.
But the importance of
I believe it. I told that they use the folk media, the oral culture is very important in a country like Bangladesh. Yeah, songs such as our own culture. We have like pot songs. We have in my area as well, such as called Gombhira, that we mix with edutainment like acting, like forum theater, about you know it. So of course we have the importance, but at the same time we need to be very careful that this pandemic has created a unique situation, an extraordinary situation. We could not do anything outside. And even there is a gap, such as the digital divide, the access to internet. So it is very difficult to say whether we are participatory or not during this pandemic. And it is the pandemic that has led the NGO to do the information role, informative role, such as it's called sometimes one way to actually disseminate their communicative materials to the audience. So of course, I will say it is a participatory, but in the current context, participatory could not be applied at all.
Thank you very much. I have just another quick question. If you can see from here, in the digital age, it is not time to retire. Is it not the time to retire participation, given that we discussed that it's a structural dimension, there are so many other institutional issues? If you can very quickly comment on that, because we are running out of time.
I understand. From my point of view, so an NGO among the audience of the public, it is not only the community, there are also some stakeholders are there. Communication happens in participatory process. The stakeholder communicate, government communicate, the journalists communicate. Of course, some proportion of people communicate and save the message. Sometimes they also make the comment, and the comment becomes, the major message in that particular flow of communication. So of course, participation goes in that way, but it is not the projected way that the NGOs is thinking. Communication is changed on the way. Sometimes I am saying something and it may be changed by the audience. The audience may be more educated than me. He or she has more information, valid information, or current scientific information than me. And then it will be contested as well. Of course, participation is important. And in that way, participation can happen. So many stakeholders, many journalists, many learned people, doctors come into the floor through their communicative behavior and their expertise as well.
May I share something too on how we use participation in online methodologies or research?
Sure, please go ahead very quickly.
Because it's really very challenging to still continue with participatory processes in a situation that is not face-to-face, that is using online methodologies. So here we really tried very hard how to still involve the community, even in our situation analysis for participatory rapid communication appraisal. So what we did was to get area coordinators. In place of us doing the facilitation in the community, we selected a group of area coordinators to be the facilitators, and we trained them on how they will also be facilitating in the community. We used the Zoom online, and what we did was for them to show to us what they are doing in the setting. So they were still able to use the meta cards, doing the Venn diagram, doing the social matrix ranking, doing or gathering or using secondary data, because the video, their cameras was turned on them, on what they are doing. So we were able to see how they were participating, how they were developing or providing data on, let's say, possible or potential partners using the Venn diagram, which they still did. They illustrated, they developed, and they showed it. They showed the outputs to us on screen. So I think in a way there is still some participation that is possible in that way. And then maybe later on towards the end of the project, we will know should we retire participation or not? So that's an important question for us to answer, because the next step is that because we cannot gather the data, then definitely these trained area coordinators on participatory communication appraisal will be the one gathering the data for us, because now they will be getting members from a community and administering the data collection. But they are on screen. We can see, we can view them, because we want to be assured that they are doing the job. And again, the problem is if they are gathered in one area with the limitations also of the internet, we are now looking for a place, an area in the city or in the town where there is strong internet connection, and we will bring the participants to that place. And the problem is we are limited to 10 people because we might be accused of spreading the COVID virus with 10 people. So again, change strategy. We cannot put 10 people in a room, at least probably 5. So there will be 2 simultaneous sessions going on. So it's like we are putting in video, capturing on video, the participatory face-to-face processes. And we are still waiting what's going to happen, because really the challenge of looking for venues where there is strong internet connection in rural areas, and these are far-flung rural areas because these are disaster-prone areas, highland areas where there is landslide. So those are the things that we are grappling with now, because we really cannot travel. 1 year already, the project has been delayed because of the COVID. So we have to totally 360-degree revise our methodologies. And slowly we're still trying to come up with trying to include some participation, and we will see later on whether we have
very interesting.
Just I want
very
to add
interesting
2 lines.
Discussion.
Just I want to add 2
running
lines.
out of time.
Just want to add 2 lines, if you just allow me. So I just want to add with Professor Maria that yes, some level of participation is happening. It is a stakeholder level, such as knowledge production level, such as engaging the experts, doctors. In that level, it's happening because a teacher. But at the community level, people who do not have access to internet, who do not have access to electricity, how they will come, how they will interact with you. Participants requires like oral culture interaction with you, such as 2-way process, whether they are understand or not. And it is not only the input from the source, input from the recipient. The target audience is also important. They also need to say what are their problems and what the solution they think about. In the COVID-19, the solution do not come from the audience. It comes from the experts. We need to keep in mind. And this is why
very interesting discussion. Yeah, Dr. Ali, I really appreciate your thought, and Tirol for your conversation with Dr. Ali. So with that, I like to conclude our presentation and discussion part 3. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us to thank our speaker and discussant for their wonderful presentation and discussion.
Thank you so much for organizing, Dr. Chowdhury.
Thank you so much. If anyone wants to write me, my email I'm giving to everyone, please communicate with me, and I'm happy to share. I'm doing a number of research on COVID-19 and look for collaborative research as well. I'm giving my Gmail account. If Atul sir should give to my email to other people, please.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, with this, I'd like to conclude our event today, and I hope you have enjoyed the event. There are many ideas to discuss. You can see already from the discussion. I really enjoyed the discussion the whole morning. I hope you guys also enjoy it. Let's continue the discussion and engage again in part 3 of the series that we will organize in summer, especially in connection with our annual meeting of the Canadian Communication Association. So please join me again for a big applause to all of our speakers, facilitators, and of course for your participation, our participant for this event. And thank you for your time and contribution. I like to play one more time with, for all of your contribution. I wish you a wonderful weekend to all of you. As we leave, maybe I like to request you to to open your camera and say bye to everyone.
Thank you, Professor Gao.
Thanks to Professor Dr. Ataha, Professor Katherin, Professor Gordon Brown. Thank you all. Thank you, the audience. I invited some people, they came, my friends. So thank you all. My students also came, Mohammed Farad. I'm leaving. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.